All right, YouTube, there's more news from the Hanford site. That is an atomic waste disposal site, supposedly mostly decommissioned. For most of the Cold War, radioactive materials were stored here. They used double storage containers, which supposedly were top of the line. It turns out that some of these methods don't actually work long term. I guess that the idea of radioactive waste that lasts thousands of years did not occur to them when they were designing units that would last for a few decades. You've got more sick workers there. Unfortunately, radioactive waste has been leaking at the Hanford site fairly recently. They discovered that one of these leaks was actually far more significant than it had previously been. That was reported on, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. And then we have new reports now that a host of workers have inhaled toxic fumes of some sort or another. I'm not sure if it's been confirmed yet whether those were radioactive fumes or whether we're talking about some chemical used to process nuclear waste that just happens to be on site, or something involved with, routine maintenance. Did somebody spill some fucking ammonia on the floor during the night shift or something? But regardless, workers have been sickened there. It really is America's Fukushima, and it's unfortunately it's near enough to the Columbia River to where this material, if it leaks to any substantial degree, it ends up in the Pacific Ocean. Well, people are always worried about Fukushima, and they should be, by the way. The idea that dilution is the solution, and that by diluting high-level radioactive waste in the Pacific, that takes care, it's out of sight, out of mind, that's just not sensible. These nuclear materials that are being leached around the world were originally found as ores within the Earth, not connected with the surface water tables, not in the ocean, not in blah, 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 deep within the Earth. That's where these ores are found, uraninite ore and so forth. I believe there's uraninite, uranophane, and some other materials that are radioactive. They get sort of processed into these various nuclear materials. And unfortunately, mankind, in his haste to build weapons and to power his cities, brought this material to the surface, made it far more deadly by, unfortunately, purifying it and then using it. And there's a great deal of waste then that gets, ironically enough, buried back within the earth. The problem is that we look to whether things are economic or not before we look to whether things are safe or not, generally speaking. The idea is that a little bit of risk over the long span of time is generally judged to be okay by governments and by corporations. So when you're burying this nuclear waste, the idea is, well, for the next 30, 40 years, we don't have to worry about having a problem, so most of us will be dead by then. We don't have anything to worry about. Let a future generation handle it. And so they don't necessarily take all the steps they could make to safeguard this material. Instead of burying it back deep within the earth, in some sort of material that will actually contain it, it's essentially just locked in these drums or these other units that they use and put in a salt cave somewhere, something like that. It often leaks. I can't remember the site that had the problem there. I believe it was a salt cave that had a cave-in like last year. That may have been the Hanford site for all I know, so don't crucify me for not knowing right off the top of my head. I try to keep up to date on nuclear disasters and things of that nature. Fukushima, I'm up to date on what's happening there. And the reason why, by the way, I should probably point this out. The reason why I haven't made a Fukushima video in a while is because it's a snafu. It's situation normal, all fucked up. We know that the Fukushima site is not going to be taken care of within our lifetimes. It's not. The material there cannot be contained through conventional means. It's obvious that neither TEPCO nor the government of Japan is willing to take the steps necessary to actually block off the molten, materials, the actual melted down remnants of what used to be reactor 3 especially, but I believe to a lesser degree reactors 1 and 2. It's obvious that they're not willing to take the steps and incur the costs necessary to actually safeguard the site. So it's going to be like Chernobyl. There will be a continuing area around it of high radioactivity. lower level contaminants far further around, a slow leakage of this radioactive material into the ocean. The reason why I say dilution is not the solution is because of the concept of bioaccumulation. Nowhere better can we see this than the ocean, of course, those little microorganisms that are going to end up with that radiation in their systems get gobbled up by bigger life forms, and it accumulates over time higher in the food chain. The problem is human beings have a great love for things like tuna, shark, some of these other species in the ocean. Certainly some of the bottom dwellers that we routinely harvest that have concentrated the radioactivity from whatever kelp or seaweed of whatever sort they happen to have been eating during their lifespan. That accumulates. It's going to accumulate in us. It's not like it's out of sight, out of mind. It's just out of sight. The fact that you can't see the radioactivity there doesn't mean it's not there. And none of it is natural. Most of what we call background radiation is the result of atomic weapons testing. You wouldn't be getting the same background levels before the Cold War began. If you could go back to before you actually had nuclear weapons going off literally by the many hundreds in the United States alone, the same in the Soviet Union. The French and British did their tests. Everyone else has been testing. They continued testing through half of the 1990s. If you could go back before the 1940s, when Trinity was the test was made, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you'd probably notice background radiation in many areas of the world was a little bit lower. That is that not all of the isotopes have fully decayed yet. There are some that are longer lived than that. Of course, the radioactive iodine's gone by now from all nuclear testing, even the later day testing. Some of it's still there. A lot of the rest is contaminants from industrial things that we've been doing as a human race, unfortunately. Another share would definitely be nuclear power and all the waste that over time has been distributed. Chernobyl and Fukushima alone have probably put out more radioactive contaminants into the world's this world's soil, the world's water, and so forth, than all of the atomic weapons testing combined, because of course when you actually fire an atomic weapon and it explodes and it undergoes fission, a lot of that material that would otherwise be contaminating anything is burned off. A great deal of that matter is essentially ripped apart at the atomic level. But the Hanford site has been screwed up for some time. This is not a new story. A lot of people are seeing it for the first time. They're saying, oh, what's this? Radioactive waste site and workers sickened. Oh my God, well, it's the end of the world. Well, you would have flipped out many years ago then if you thought that that was the case. It's not like the site's new. It's been storing this waste for a very long time. It's not new news any more than the fact that Fukushima had problems should have been new even at the time that it melted down. Fukushima still had the same engineering problems that eventually led to it melting down before it actually did. Chernobyl had its own problems before it melted down. A little bit of foresight would be great. I mean, the average person doesn't have at their disposal the means to look up the blueprints of nuclear sites. I would think you'd probably get a visit from the FBI if you did. To look those up, make sure everything's kosher, nor would they have the time and inclination to do so, nor would they have the training and knowledge necessary to judge that accurately in the first place. A lot of times when people say doom and gloom about nuclear stuff, they don't even really know what they're talking about. I've had to point out on 2 different videos, the biggest threat during an atomic war isn't even the atomic bombs going off. If you get hit by one of those, you're dead. You get vaporized. You won't even feel a thing. You'll just burn into a pile of ashes, unless you're unlucky enough to be in the firestorm thereafter and then slowly cooked to death. The biggest threat is actually from nuclear plants. They are in fact a form of crude nuclear deterrent in and of themselves, because causing them all to melt down, as would happen in an atomic war when the entire world loses stability, would release many times more radiation than the bombs would. It would create, essentially, if you've watched Dr. Strangelove, something similar to a doomsday shroud that would blanket the whole world with so much radioactivity the human race would be extinguished, or very nearly so. It would be mass suffering for centuries thereafter. Hanford is just a remnant of this period of paranoia, really, among the human race, in which we staved off further war by the threat of war that would destroy everybody. Unfortunately, while mutually assured destruction was essentially it worked. It won't always work. It will break down and lead to a nuclear war, but it's working at the moment, at least. Mostly. It's working now, and it's been working. Unfortunately, the materials left behind from actually building the weapons and making the nuclear fuel for the power plants and all of the industrial applications of radioactivity and radioactive materials in various forms, that has become almost as big a danger. It's just sitting there sometimes in these shallow pits and tunnels and caves, waiting for an accident to happen. There's enough nuclear fuel there, so if you had a total fucked up situation, if you had a fire somewhere in there, somehow it happened, as keeps happening at radioactive waste dumps and nuclear plants, and they all have these weird accidents all the time. It's like Murphy's Law in action. You have a real problem at a site like Hanford, and it's going to be so radioactive, you're not even going to be able to send like a drone in to see what's ultimately even happening. You're going to have to stay back half a mile, or you'll very quickly keel over with mass cancer all over your fucking body and die. And that's really been the problem at Fukushima. They sent robots in to videotape the inside of Reactor 3, as some of those robots have just broken down. They stop working because there's so much radioactivity. You can even see it in the feeds. If you watch the feeds that TEPCO has actually put online, you can see all these weird, sparkly little pixelated glowings all over the camera, especially as it moves deeper into the reactor. What is that? It's the result of radioactivity really frying the cameras that they're using very slowly. Radioactivity is messing with its electronic systems and getting them fucked up. It would be very difficult for them to really do that much about the Hanford site. That's the other problem. The other problem is that past generations that didn't ultimately know quite what they were doing, they had the right idea, maybe their heart was in the right place, but their mind was just a little bit behind where their heart was, deposited all of this material, built all the nuclear infrastructure and the reliance upon atomic energy, built all the weapons, and then stood back, scratched its head, and said, oh shit, what are we going to do now? How the fuck we dispose of all this bullshit? And so now they'll leave it for future generations to deal with. The Hanford site is screwed up, and now you have a bunch of sick workers. Again, though, I don't know if they were sickened by radioactivity per se, but then again, there's probably all sorts of other goodies on site that could have sickened them, let's face it. You got all sorts of industrial waste. Thankfully, right next to a major river, yeah, that's great. I'm sure that was the best place they could possibly put it. They might as well just take a barge and load it with nuclear waste and like anchor it offshore in the Pacific itself at some point and say, oh, it's safe enough. We keep one dude on there with a revolver in case, terrorists try to steal the nuclear waste. And there's some floaty things on the side of the barge. So if it springs a leak, it'll kind of still be afloat. It's okay. It's good enough, I suppose, for at least the next couple of years or so. And then a hurricane hits it and it sinks, and all of a sudden they wonder why all the tuna that they're eating glows in the dark. That's essentially story of mankind's life when it comes to nuclear stuff. You gotta realize, we're not that deep into the atomic era. Trinity and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're talking about the mid-1940s. You're not talking about ancient Han Dynasty or the rise of Rome or something very far back in the human timeline when we were already sophisticated. No, it's very recent in human development. In only a few thousand generations, really, we went from making very primitive wooden spears with stone heads on them and wearing uncured, deer skins and shit like that, to blowing up weapons capable of destroying entire cities. And we've decided somehow that making thousands of them is a good idea. We're now using it to power all of our other goodies and luxuries, most of which we don't even need, let's face it. It's rather funny. The human race is somewhat suicidal. I also had a random thought. This isn't connected to Hanford, but I had a random weird thought last night. I thought of the modern city, and it dawned on me. A city is just a giant wasteland of low biodiversity. Speaking from an ecological perspective, that is that human beings have tried to exclude most life forms from actually living there. It's like created a wasteland of sorts in which there are a handful of floral species that are living there. Mold loves it, and some rodents, and then mankind's pets, and that's all the species that inhabit that area. At least they're the only ones that are supposed to, according to the people that are living there. It's like a massively densely, it's like a rodent nest or something. It's like, have you ever dug into a mole's nest accidentally? There was a mole's nest under our compost pile once. There was some baby moles and I guess the mommy and daddy mole and so forth. It smelled terrible, and it was like really warm, like right where they had been nesting, because they were insulated by all this. The compost was no longer creating heat. It had already rotted down into soil, basically. But there's like this warm, weird pocket where the moles had been. There's like, it smelled like shit and everything. That's like a modern city when you really think about it. Just a random thought that I had, but I mean, it is. It's a low biodiversity zone. I think the one exception is like the urban prairie of Detroit. Beavers have moved back in, and there's like feral dogs and shit now there because there are so many abandoned homes. I was on Street View the other night on Google Street View, going through Detroit and saying yeah to myself over and over. I found that amusing. There are parts of the city where you're only like 5 or 6 blocks from the downtown, but you put it in the street and you turn around in any direction, it doesn't look like you're even in a city anymore. It looks like you're somewhere out in the countryside in a suburban region where there are 2 or 3 houses that are actually visible, 1 or 2 of which may even be lived in still. Most of the rest of the houses are abandoned. It's surreal. I mean, they're actually like, they don't even need like a Detroit City Zoo, because all the wild animals are going to start moving back into these abandoned zones. They just need to clear out the last few homes. I don't know. I just thought that was a funny thought. It's kind of related to the human condition, I suppose, which goes hand in hand with the shit going on at Hanford and Fukushima and Chernobyl and all of these other retard sites where people do retarded things. That's about all. Peace out.